The notice was taped to my front door on the coldest morning of the year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say the temperature had dropped so far overnight that my truck's door handle snapped clean off when I grabbed it. 17 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill putting it somewhere around 5 below. The kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside and makes you seriously question every life decision that led you to buying a house in this particular zip code. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight. The roads were an absolute mess. My furnace was working overtime, and I had about 1,000 things on my mind that morning. Scraping ice off my windshield. Figuring out if the roads were safe enough to drive. Wondering if the propane tank on my back deck was going to run low before the weekend delivery. What I was not thinking about was my hose bib. For those who don't know, a hose bib is just the outdoor faucet on the side of your house. The little spigot you attach a garden hose to in the summer. During winter, you're supposed to shut off the water supply to it from inside and let it drain so the pipe doesn't freeze and burst. I had done exactly that back in October, like any reasonably prepared homeowner. The hose bib itself was still mounted on the exterior wall of my house, sticking out maybe 2 inches, which is how hose bibs work. That's how they've always worked. That's how every hose bib in the history of outdoor plumbing has worked. None of that mattered to Vicki Ledbetter. I peeled the notice off my door and stood there in the freezing cold, reading it with one gloved hand while my coffee went cold in the other. The letterhead was from the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association, and at the top it said, "Notice of Violation," in big, bold letters like it was a summons from the federal government. My name was on it, my address. And then, in the description of the alleged violation, it said the following, and I'm reading this word for word because I photographed it immediately. The exterior of the property at the above-listed address presents a structural protrusion in violation of HOA Community Standards Section 4, Paragraph 11, which prohibits unauthorized exterior modifications or structural additions not approved by the HOA Architectural Review Committee. The protruding fixture on the north-facing exterior wall has been identified as a structural violation. The homeowner has 14 days to remove the protrusion or face fines beginning at $150 per day. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I stood there for a solid 10 seconds while the wind cut right through my coat. They were talking about my frozen hose bib. My standard factory-installed has been there since the house was built outdoor faucet. They were calling it an unauthorized structural addition. I looked at the hose bib. There it was on the north wall, frozen solid, a thin sheet of ice coating the spigot where condensation had built up and frozen overnight. Just sitting there, doing nothing, being completely normal, minding its own business in the 17-degree morning air. And according to Vicki Ledbetter, it was a structural violation. I went inside, sat down at my kitchen table and took a long drink of my now lukewarm coffee. I wasn't furious yet. I was still in the phase where you're just baffled. The pure, crystalline bafflement of a man who has been told that the faucet his house came with is somehow illegal. Let me back up and give you some context about Vicki Ledbetter, because she doesn't come out of nowhere in this story. She'd been on the Maplewood Ridge HOA board for going on 4 years, and in that time she had become the kind of HOA presence that makes normal people seriously research whether they can legally secede from a homeowners association. She wasn't the president, technically. That was a retired guy named Bob Hensley who mostly just showed up to meetings, nodded a lot, and signed whatever Vicki put in front of him. Vicki was the Standards and Compliance Director, a title she had apparently invented herself and added to the HOA bylaws 2 years ago with very little pushback, because most of the neighborhood had no idea it was happening. She was the kind of woman who wore a puffy vest to every HOA meeting even when it was held indoors in the summer. She drove a white SUV that she kept immaculate. She had a Ring doorbell, 2 additional cameras on her porch, and a notebook she carried everywhere that she claimed was for documenting community concerns. She had sent notices to at least 6 of my neighbors in the past year for things like a slightly misaligned mailbox post, a wind chime that was allegedly too loud, and a porch light she decided was the wrong shade of white. I had heard all these stories from my neighbors, of course. We talked. We all knew Vicki. We had all been waiting for our turn. Apparently, my turn had come in the form of a frozen hose bib in the middle of a blizzard. I called my neighbor Dave Kowalski first, because Dave was the kind of guy who always knew things. He'd lived in Maplewood Ridge for 12 years, had dealt with the HOA before it was Vicki's personal kingdom, and had a calm, methodical way of thinking through problems that I genuinely respected. I caught him mid-shovel on his driveway, which told you something about how his morning was going too. "Vicki hit you," he said, not even surprised. "She called my hose bib a structural violation," I said. There was a pause. Then he started laughing, not a polite laugh either. A real, full-throated laugh that I could hear even over the wind. "Okay," he said, catching his breath. Okay, here's what you need to know about that. Pull out your HOA governing documents tonight. I know you got them when you bought the house. Read Section 4 carefully. Actually read the whole thing, because I'm willing to bet what she cited doesn't say what she thinks it says." I told him I would. We hung up. I went back inside, pulled my furnace thermostat up another 2 degrees because the house had gotten cold while I was standing at the door, and I went to find my closing documents from when I bought the house 3 years ago. They were in a manila folder in my filing cabinet, which, honestly, I hadn't opened in a while. But I found them. I found the CC and RS, the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, and I started reading Section 4. It took me about 20 minutes to get through it, because these documents are written in the particular flavor of legal language that seems designed to make you lose the will to live. But I got through it, and Dave was absolutely right. Section 4, paragraph 11, which Vicki had cited in her notice, said this in plain terms. No homeowner could add exterior structures or modifications to the exterior of their home without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. It applied to things like adding a deck, putting up a fence, installing a permanent awning, or making changes to the existing roofline. There was a list of examples. None of them were a hose bib. And critically, the language of the paragraph specified that it applied to modifications made by the homeowner after the date of purchase, meaning changes you make, not fixtures that came with the house when it was built. My hose bib had been there since the house was constructed in 2008. I had not installed it. I had not modified it. It was original equipment. It was, if anything, a factory standard. A hose bib sticking 2 inches out of an exterior wall was not a structural addition by any reasonable reading of that paragraph or any unreasonable one. I made notes. I wrote down the exact language of the paragraph. I took photos of the relevant pages. I pulled up the local building code on my laptop, and sure enough, exterior hose bibs on single-family homes were not just permitted but specifically required to meet certain specifications under residential plumbing standards. You couldn't even legally build a house in my county without proper exterior water access. The hose bib wasn't a violation of anything. It was a code requirement. By this point I was fully awake and considerably less baffled, moving into a different phase. Call it focused. The next thing I did was go outside and take photographs of the hose bib from multiple angles, including one that showed the house number clearly in the frame, and one where I held up that morning's newspaper next to it to timestamp the condition. The hose bib was frozen, yes. It was coated in ice. It looked, frankly, a little dramatic sitting there all encased in frost. But it was structurally sound, properly mounted, and absolutely 100% the same hose bib that had been on that wall since 2008, likely installed by the contractor who built the house. I also photographed the snow on the ground, the thermometer on my back deck reading 17 degrees, and the frost on the windows. Context, I figured, couldn't hurt. Then I drafted a response letter. I kept it polite. Firm, very firm, but polite. I cited Section 4, Paragraph 11 verbatim. I explained that the fixture in question was original to the home, not a modification made by me or any previous owner after the date of construction, and therefore fell entirely outside the scope of the provisions cited. I also noted that exterior hose bibs were required by county residential plumbing code, and that removing one would, in fact, put me in violation of county standards. I included the relevant code citation. I printed it on my own letterhead, signed it, made a copy, and delivered it by hand to the HOA's registered mailing address, which was a P.O. box, and then also emailed it to the general HOA contact address. I sent the email with a read receipt. I also stopped by the Maplewood Ridge Community Facebook group and posted a friendly but very public message. I said something like, "Hey neighbors, just got a notice from the HOA calling my original factory-installed outdoor hose bib a structural violation. The relevant section of the CC and RS clearly doesn't apply to original home fixtures. Anyone else had similar notices? Would love to compare notes." Then I sat back and watched the notifications roll in. They rolled in fast. Turns out Vicki had been busy. In the 3 weeks since the first major snowfall of the season, she had sent out 11 separate violation notices to homeowners across the neighborhood. 11. In 3 weeks. In the middle of one of the coldest winters we'd had in a decade, when people were dealing with frozen pipes, heating system failures, icy driveways, and cars that wouldn't start in the morning. She had sent notices about a basketball hoop someone had set up in their own driveway, a snow blower someone had left on their front porch temporarily while they cleared their walk, a holiday wreath one neighbor had hung on their mailbox, and several notices about outdoor decorations that hadn't been taken down within Vicki's personally preferred timeline. And then there was a pattern that started becoming clear from the comments on that post. Several of the neighbors who had received notices had also received follow-up visits from Vicki in person, where she had, in various ways, hinted that the violation could be resolved quickly if the homeowner agreed to vote a certain way on the upcoming HOA budget vote, which was scheduled for the following month. The budget vote included, among other things, a proposal to hire a community compliance consultant at an annual rate of about $12,000. The compliance consultant position had no job description beyond what Vicki had summarized verbally at the last meeting, as assisting the standards and compliance director with enforcement. That landed in my stomach like a cold rock. I called my neighbor Sandra Acaffer, who had mentioned in the comments that she'd had a conversation with Vicki about her violation notice. Sandra was sharp, careful, and not easily rattled, and when I asked her to walk me through what Vicki had said during that conversation, Sandra did exactly that, calmly and in detail. Vicki had shown up at Sandra's door one evening, uninvited, said she was there to discuss the violation notice Sandra had received about her mailbox decoration. After a few minutes of that conversation, Vicki had pivoted to talking about the upcoming budget vote, specifically the compliance consultant position, and said something along the lines of, "I just think that neighbors who work with the board tend to have their concerns resolved much more smoothly." Sandra had taken that as what it clearly was, a veiled suggestion that supporting Vicki's budget item would make the violation notice go away. That wasn't a gray area. That was coercion. That was someone using the HOA enforcement process to pressure homeowners into voting a certain way on a financial matter, which, depending on how you sliced it, edged into extortion territory. I'm not a lawyer, but I know the shape of a thing. Sandra had not recorded the conversation, which was frustrating but understandable. Nobody expects to need a recording when a neighbor shows up to talk about a mailbox. But Sandra had written down the details of the conversation immediately afterward in a notes app on her phone with a timestamp. That was something. Over the next 2 days, the community Facebook thread grew into something substantial. I had messages from 8 neighbors, and collectively we were sitting on the following: 11 violation notices sent in 3 weeks, all citing the same Section 4 in contexts where it clearly did not apply. 3 separate accounts of Vicki making in-person visits that included comments linking the resolution of violations to the budget vote. One account from a homeowner named Phil Rutherford, who said Vicki had been even more direct with him, telling him flatly that his violation would be expedited through review if he supported the budget item, and that neighbors who didn't cooperate with the board sometimes found compliance issues taking much longer to resolve. Phil had actually recorded part of that conversation on his phone, because Phil, bless him, had dealt with exactly this kind of thing before, and had started recording interactions with HOA representatives as a standard practice. I asked Phil to send me the audio. He did. I also went back and started digging into the HOA's financial records, which are technically public documents that any member of the HOA is entitled to request. I submitted a formal written request to the HOA board for the last 2 years of financial statements, meeting minutes, and the treasurer's reports. This is completely legal. HOAs are required to maintain these records and provide them to members upon request. I know because I had looked it up about a year earlier when Vicki had started getting aggressive with the neighborhood, and I had a feeling something like this might eventually land on my doorstep. While I was waiting for those records, the weather did what winter does and got worse. We got another 6 inches of snow overnight. The roads were a sheet of ice in the morning, and my street didn't get plowed until almost noon because the city's plows were stretched thin across the whole metro area. I spent a good chunk of the morning shoveling my driveway and salting my front walk, which gave me plenty of time to think and also to notice something interesting. Vicki's house was 3 doors down from mine on the same street. I had a clear line of sight to it from my driveway. And while I was out there shoveling in the 17-degree wind, I noticed that Vicki's own hose bib on the east-facing side of her house was not only visible but was actually dripping. Or rather, it had been dripping at some point, because there was a spectacular icicle formation hanging off it, which meant her hose bib had not been properly winterized. There was water in that line. The drip had frozen into a 2-foot icicle that was hanging off her exterior faucet in a genuinely impressive arc. I took pictures, obviously, from across the street, zoomed in on my phone, multiple angles with the timestamp visible, just because. Now I wasn't going to be petty about it. I wasn't going to run to the HOA and file a complaint about Vicki's icicle. That's not the kind of person I am, and honestly it would undercut the whole point of what I was doing, which was demonstrating that the HOA's enforcement was arbitrary, capricious, and being used for personal gain rather than actual community standards. But having the photos was a nice thing, just in case. The HOA responded to my written dispute letter on day 8 of the 14-day window. The response came via email and was signed by Bob Hensley as HOA president, but the language in it was unmistakably Vicki. I'd heard her speak at enough meetings to recognize her cadence. The letter said my dispute had been reviewed and denied, that the Architectural Review Committee had independently assessed the fixture and confirmed it was a violation, and that the 14-day compliance window stood with fines beginning on day 15. First of all, there was no Architectural Review Committee. I mean, technically there was one in the bylaws, but it was supposed to have 3 members, and the only person who had ever functioned in that role was Vicki herself. She was the committee. So, independently assessed, was doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Second of all, the letter still didn't explain how a factory original hose bib on a house built in 2008 constituted an unauthorized modification by me, the current homeowner. My dispute had laid that argument out clearly and with citations. The response just said, denied, without engaging with the argument at all. I wrote back immediately, politely, requesting a formal hearing before the full HOA board as permitted under the CC and RS, specifically Section 9, which laid out a homeowner's right to contest a violation notice. I put that request in writing, sent it by email with read receipt, and also mailed a hard copy via certified mail. Then I made a phone call. The phone call was to a real estate attorney named Gwen Abramovitz, who a coworker had recommended to me once for exactly the kind of situation where an HOA is clearly overstepping. I wasn't sure I needed full legal representation yet, but I wanted 20 minutes of her time to explain what was happening and get a professional read on whether I was thinking about it correctly. Gwen listened to the whole thing. I told her about the notice, the hose bib, the Section 4 citation, my response, the denial, and what I'd learned about the pattern of notices and the budget vote. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "The violation notice is meritless on its face. You're right about that. But the pattern you're describing with the other homeowners and the budget vote comments, that's a different category of problem. If homeowners can document that board members were conditioning enforcement actions on HOA vote outcomes, you're potentially looking at a breach of fiduciary duty, abuse of authority, and depending on how it was communicated, it could touch on extortion under your state statutes. I'd want to look at Phil's recording." I sent her the recording that afternoon. Gwen called back the next morning and said two things. One, the recording was clear enough to be useful. Phil had recorded Vicki explicitly linking the resolution of his violation notice to his vote on the budget item. It wasn't ambiguous. Two, Gwen was going to put together a formal demand letter on behalf of me and whatever neighbors wanted to join in, which would be sent to the HOA board and the HOA's own attorney of record, which Gwen had identified through the HOA's registration paperwork. The letter would demand immediate withdrawal of all the contested violation notices, a full accounting of the Architectural Review Committee's claimed independent assessment, and a postponement of the budget vote pending review of the board's conduct. It would also put the board on notice that the evidence of improper linking of enforcement actions to voting outcomes was being reviewed for potential legal action. I went back to the neighborhood Facebook group and asked who wanted to formally join the dispute. 7 families signed on within 24 hours. Meanwhile, the financial records I had requested finally arrived, in the form of a somewhat disorganized PDF that Bob Hensley had emailed to me after about 3 days of delay. I went through them carefully on a Sunday afternoon, while the snow fell outside and the wind rattled my windows. My propane tank was full, my furnace was running steady, and I had a pot of soup on the stove and a quiet house, which meant I could actually focus. What I found in those financial records was interesting, and by interesting I mean genuinely alarming. The HOA's annual budget had been running an apparent surplus for the past 2 years, meaning the association was collecting more in dues than it was spending on legitimate maintenance and community services. That alone isn't necessarily a problem. HOAs are supposed to maintain reserve funds for major repairs. But what was unusual was a line item in the expenditures for each of the past 2 years labeled administrative services, which had grown from about $4,000 to just over $9,000 in the most recent year. The meeting minutes I'd requested didn't include any discussion or approval of this increase, and the budget proposals for the upcoming year included that $12,000 compliance consultant position that Vicki had been pressuring homeowners to vote for. I flagged this for Gwen. She said she'd want a CPA to look at it, but that administrative services expenses that grew significantly without documented board approval or disclosed scope of work were worth scrutinizing, especially when the person driving budget expansion was also the one sending out violation notices to strong-arm the vote. By this point, the community was buzzing, and not in the good neighborhood cookout kind of way. People were talking on the Facebook group, in driveways, across fences, in the parking lot of the grocery store 2 streets over. There was a general feeling that had been building for a couple of years, that Vicki's hold on the HOA's enforcement apparatus had gotten out of control, and my hose bib notice had somehow become the tipping point. Maybe because it was so absurd. Maybe because the winter had been brutal and people were tired and cold, and not inclined to tolerate bureaucratic nonsense on top of everything else. Maybe because people had just reached their limit. Whatever it was, the energy in the neighborhood had shifted. One of my neighbors, a quiet woman named Margaret Chen, who I had maybe spoken to twice in 3 years, knocked on my door one evening to tell me she had a security camera on her front porch that she'd installed the previous spring. She said the camera had a wide enough angle that it captured part of the street and the sidewalk in front of her house. She had gone back through the footage for the past few weeks, and she had footage of Vicki walking up to several different houses in the neighborhood during evening hours over the past 3 weeks, including a clear shot of Vicki at Phil's front door on the night Phil said the conversation about the budget vote had happened. The footage didn't have audio, but it confirmed the visit. It corroborated Phil's timeline. I thanked Margaret sincerely and asked if she'd share the relevant clips with Gwen. She said yes without hesitating. The formal hearing on my violation notice was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, which turned out to be an absolutely miserable night weather-wise, with freezing rain coming down on top of the existing snow pack and making every surface a skating rink. I almost considered postponing, but I was not going to give Vicki Ledbetter the satisfaction of me not showing up. I drove carefully, took the back way where the road surface was better, and arrived at the community clubhouse, which was a room in a shared building at the end of the main road through Maplewood Ridge, about 10 minutes before the scheduled start time. I had not expected as many people to be there as showed up. The room held maybe 40 people in folding chairs, and it was nearly full. All of the neighbors who had joined the formal dispute were there, plus a lot of others who had come just to watch. Dave Kowalski was there, sitting with his arms crossed, wearing a look of calm anticipation. Sandra Acaffer was there with her phone in her lap. Phil Rutherford was there, and I noticed he had his phone out with the recording app open, which I thought was sensible. Margaret Chen was there with a folder of printed screenshots from her security footage. Vicki was at the front of the room, sitting at the board table with Bob Hensley, who looked like he would rather be absolutely anywhere else. The two of them had a third person with them who I didn't recognize, a younger woman with a clipboard who turned out to be some kind of volunteer assistant Vicki had apparently brought along. There was no HOA attorney present. That was notable. When I sat down, Gwen Abramovitz was next to me. She had shown up on her own initiative, she said, because she thought it might be useful to have legal representation present for the hearing. I was very glad she was there. Vicki opened the meeting with a brisk recitation of the alleged violation, the same language from the notice, very official sounding, delivered in the tone of someone who has convinced herself she is conducting a courtroom proceeding. Bob Hensley nodded along. The assistant with the clipboard wrote things down. I waited until Vicki finished, and then I asked, calmly and clearly, whether I could present my response. Bob said yes, of course. Vicki looked like she wanted to say something about the order of proceedings but held off. I laid it out. The CC and RS. Section 4, paragraph 11, exactly as written. The fact that it explicitly applied to homeowner-made modifications after the date of purchase, not to original fixtures. The County Residential Plumbing Code requiring exterior water access. The fact that the hose bib had been installed in 2008 during original construction. I had a copy of my home inspection report from when I bought the house 3 years ago, which documented the hose bib as existing, functional, and original to the property, with no noted concerns. I put that in front of the board. Then Gwen spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. She introduced herself as legal counsel representing me and several other homeowners in the community, explained that the violation notice was legally meritless and had no foundation in the cited provision of the CC and RS, and then, quietly and precisely, said that the board should also be aware that her clients had compiled documentation related to a pattern of conduct that went beyond the individual violation notices. and that this documentation had been referred to an attorney for review regarding potential claims, including abuse of board authority and improper conditioning of enforcement actions on homeowner votes. The room was very quiet. Bob Hensley had stopped nodding. Vicki said something about the documentation being taken out of context, and that the board had always acted in the best interests of the community, and a few people in the room made sounds that were not quite laughter but were in that direction. Then Phil Rutherford stood up and said, politely, that he had a recording he thought might be relevant. He played about 90 seconds of it through his phone speaker, loud enough for the room to hear clearly. It was Vicki's voice, unmistakably telling Phil that violation resolutions tended to go more smoothly for neighbors who worked with the board on its priorities, and that the budget vote coming up was something the board hoped to see community support for. There was a longer silence after that. Bob Hensley looked at Vicki. Vicki was no longer quite so brisk. Her color had changed. Someone in the room, I couldn't see who, said out loud, "That's extortion." Gwen didn't comment on that specific word, but said clearly that the recording had been reviewed by counsel, and that its content raised serious questions about the board's fiduciary conduct, and that these questions would be addressed through appropriate channels including, if necessary, civil litigation and referral to the state's Attorney General's office, which has jurisdiction over HOA governance complaints in our state. The hearing essentially collapsed at that point. There was no formal vote taken on my violation, which I took as a good sign. Bob Hensley said the board would need time to review everything. Gwen said that was fine and reminded him that the 14-day fine commencement date was still on the calendar, and that her clients would not be paying any fines related to these notices, and that any attempt to levy fines would be met with legal action. We all drove home carefully on the icy roads. 3 days later, I received a letter on HOA letterhead, signed by Bob Hensley, informing me that my violation notice had been reviewed and withdrawn, that the fixture in question had been determined to fall outside the scope of Section 4, and that no fines would be assessed. All 6 other contested violation notices were also withdrawn simultaneously, according to the emails my neighbors received the same day. The letter made no mention of Vicki Ledbetter. But the story wasn't done there, because Gwen had already been in contact with the HOA's own attorney, a firm that had apparently not been fully briefed on the situation by the board and was not pleased when it found out. Gwen told me later that the HOA's attorney had essentially told Bob Hensley that the board's conduct, specifically the pattern of linking enforcement to the budget vote, exposed the association to significant liability, and that this needed to be addressed, not just with withdrawal of the violation notices, but with proper governance going forward. The budget vote was postponed. The compliance consultant line item was pulled from the proposal pending a full review of the HOA's spending. Gwen had also submitted the financial records and the unanswered questions about the administrative services line item to a CPA she worked with regularly. The CPA's preliminary review found that the administrative services payments over the past 2 years, totaling more than $13,000, had not been documented with any vendor contracts, invoices, or board-approved resolutions. There was no paper trail showing who had been paid or for what. When the HOA's attorney pressed the board for documentation, none was produced. At that point, the situation crossed a clear line. The HOA's attorney reported the discrepancy to the board and recommended an independent audit. Bob Hensley, now apparently beginning to understand the depth of the mess he was in, agreed to the audit and also agreed, separately, to a meeting with me, Gwen, and 2 other homeowners from our group. At that meeting, Bob was notably more forthcoming than he had been at the hearing. He was also notably absent of his usual confident composure. He looked like a man who had been doing a lot of thinking at 3 in the morning. He acknowledged that certain decisions had been made without proper documentation. He acknowledged that Vicki's conduct in the visits to homeowners had not been authorized by the board, or at least that he had not authorized it, which was either true or a convenient repositioning, but either way it was on record. The independent audit happened about 6 weeks later. It found that the $13,000 in undocumented administrative services payments over 2 years had been directed to an account held in Vicki Ledbetter's name. She had been paying herself from HOA funds for services she had never disclosed to the board or the community, services that had no documented scope, no contract, and no board approval. The audit report used careful language like payments without adequate authorization and lack of internal controls, but what it described was embezzlement. The HOA's attorney filed a police report. I heard about the police visit to Vicki's house from Dave Kowalski, who heard it from someone else, and honestly by that point the neighborhood grapevine was operating at peak efficiency. 2 officers had gone to her door on a Thursday afternoon. I don't know exactly what the conversation was because I wasn't there, and I'm not going to speculate beyond what came out publicly. But within about 2 weeks, local court records showed that Vicki Ledbetter had been charged with 1 count of theft by embezzlement, specifically the misappropriation of funds from a nonprofit organization, which is what an HOA technically is. She was arraigned, released on bail, and the case was referred to the county DA's office. Bob Hensley resigned from the HOA board about a week after the charges were filed. He sent a letter to the community saying he was stepping back for personal reasons and that he hoped the community would move forward constructively. I respected the brevity. No one was particularly surprised. The HOA held a special election to fill the vacant board seats. 4 neighbors ran, 3 of them people who had been part of the dispute group. 2 of them won seats on the board, including Sandra Acaffer, who ran on a platform of transparency, and said at the neighborhood meeting that the first thing she wanted to do was make sure every homeowner had a clear, plain English summary of what the CC and RS actually said, so nobody could weaponize the fine print again. She got a genuine round of applause for that. The new board's first official action was to formally remove the Standards and Compliance Director position from the HOA's organizational structure, on the basis that it had no legitimate foundation in the original bylaws and had been inserted without proper process. Good riddance. The violation notice against my hose bib was not only withdrawn but was struck from the HOA's records entirely. The new board sent a written acknowledgement to each homeowner who had received one of the 11 contested notices, formally stating that the notices had been issued without adequate basis and apologizing for the inconvenience. It was a small thing, a letter, but it mattered. It said that the HOA recognized what had happened and was taking responsibility. The compliance consultant budget item was never brought back. The HOA's dues for the following year were actually reduced slightly, because the audit had clarified the association's actual financial needs and revealed that the dues had been set higher than necessary to cover the undocumented administrative expenses. A small but meaningful sign that the finances were now being managed honestly. Winter eventually did what winter does and got tired of itself. The temperatures slowly climbed. The snowpack started softening around the edges, then melting in earnest. The ice on the roads broke up and washed away. My truck's door handle had been replaced by a mechanic in January, which had cost me more than I wanted to think about, but was at least one problem fully solved. The propane got delivered on schedule. The furnace ran without incident through the rest of the cold season. In late March, on a morning that was still chilly but had that particular quality of light that tells you winter is losing its grip, I went outside and unscrewed the insulating cover from my hose bib. I turned the water supply back on from inside, checked for any sign of damage from the freeze, found none, and attached a hose. I ran a little water onto the flower beds at the front of the house where the bulbs would be coming up in a few weeks. The hose bib worked perfectly. It had always worked perfectly. 2 inches of exterior plumbing, doing exactly what it was built to do, the same as it had been doing since 2008. I stood there for a minute in the pale spring light and thought about the fact that all of this, the neighbors rallying, the legal review, the audit, the charges, the board overhaul, all of it had started because Vicki Ledbetter looked at a frozen hose bib on a 17-degree morning and decided to call it a structural violation. There's something almost funny about it in retrospect. Almost. Phil Rutherford came by that afternoon to return a snow blower he'd borrowed from me back in January. We stood on my driveway and talked for a while in the warming air. He mentioned that Vicky's case had been continued by the court and was moving toward a plea hearing, that the DA's office was apparently treating it seriously, and that restitution was expected to be part of any resolution. He mentioned it matter-of-factly, not gloating, just stating a fact. I asked if he was still recording his interactions with HOA representatives as a standard practice. He grinned and said the new board didn't require it. Dave Kowalski had organized a small neighborhood gathering in early April, partly as a general spring kickoff, partly as an unofficial acknowledgement of everything that had happened over the winter, and the sense that the neighborhood had come through it in better shape than it went in. Not a party exactly, just people standing around in someone's backyard, kids running around, the first actual warmth in months sitting on everyone's faces. Sandra Acaffer was there, talking to 2 of the newer families on the block who hadn't been in the neighborhood long enough to know the full history of the previous few months. She was filling them in, not dramatically, just clearly, the way you tell someone the relevant background they need to understand the present situation. I talked to Margaret Chen for the first time at any real length. She was warmer and funnier than I'd realized, and we discovered we had about 4 neighbors in common from our previous neighborhoods, which is one of those small world moments that feels disproportionately good. She had upgraded her security camera in February, she said. Better resolution, wider angle. I told her that seemed like a reasonable investment. Someone brought a cake, store-bought, that said "Spring is here" on it in blue frosting. Someone else brought a propane grill, which felt appropriate given the season, and there was the particular smell of the first outdoor grilling of the year mixing with the cool air. Kids threw a football. A dog escaped from someone's backyard and had to be coaxed back with a piece of hot dog, which it accepted with no dignity whatsoever. It was just a neighborhood. People who happened to live near each other, who had a bad few months, who had come through it. The kind of ordinary good that doesn't make headlines and doesn't need to. I walked home that evening as the light went golden and the temperature started dropping again, the way it always does when the sun gets low, even in spring. My hose bib was visible on the north wall of my house as I came up the front walk, just the way it always was. 2 inches of spigot sticking out from the siding, a structural violation. I almost laughed. Vicki Ledbetter ultimately entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge of misappropriation of funds, paid full restitution of the $13,000 plus court costs, received 2 years of probation, and was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state under the terms of her agreement. The latter condition had apparently been pushed for specifically by the DA's office on the basis that the pattern of conduct showed a willingness to abuse community governance positions for personal benefit. The court agreed. I got a copy of the plea documentation through the public court records system because I had been tracking the case since the charges were filed. I read through it on a quiet evening with a cup of coffee. The legal language was dry, the way legal language always is, but the facts underneath it were clear. She had taken money that wasn't hers. She had used the enforcement apparatus of the HOA to pressure neighbors into supporting the budget item that would have increased her personal take. She had done it over the course of 2 years, betting that no one would look closely enough at the financial records. What she hadn't bet on was someone disputing a notice about a hose bib, reading the CC and RS closely enough to know the citation was wrong, and pulling on that thread until the whole thing unraveled. I sat back and thought about that for a moment. All the dominoes, and the first one was a frozen outdoor faucet on a 17-degree morning. The Maplewood Ridge HOA now operates under a governance framework that Sandra and the new board drafted with input from Gwen Abramovitz, who had been hired on retainer to review the association's documents and procedures. The new framework includes an annual financial audit by an independent CPA, a clear and plain language summary of the CC and RS distributed to every homeowner every January, a documented process for violation notices that requires the citing board member to provide a written explanation of how the cited provision applies to the specific situation, and a prohibition on any board member conducting unilateral compliance visits to homeowner properties without another board member present. That last rule came directly from what had happened with Phil and Sandra and the others, the unsanctioned evening visits, the private conversations about voting. That kind of thing couldn't happen in a shadow anymore. There had to be a witness. There had to be a record. Sunlight, as someone smarter than me once said, is the best disinfectant. I keep a copy of my response letter in my filing cabinet, right next to the CC and RS, right next to the photos of the frozen hose bib and the thermometer reading 17 degrees and the newspaper I held up for a timestamp that morning. I don't know why I keep them. Just to have them. Just to remember that sometimes the boring, methodical approach works. Read the documents, cite the language, connect with your neighbors, document everything, be patient. My hose bib is still there, still works perfectly. Still sticking out exactly 2 inches from the north-facing exterior wall, exactly as it was built, exactly as it will continue to be for as long as I own this house. Some things don't need to be fixed. Some things were never broken. The next winter was calmer in every sense. The temperatures dropped, the snow came, the roads iced over, the furnace worked. My neighbors and I waved at each other across snow-covered lawns, helped each other out when someone's car got stuck, shared information about which roads were cleared and which weren't. Normal stuff. The stuff a neighborhood is supposed to be made of. No violation notices arrived at my door. No notices arrived at any of my neighbors' doors, not for anything arbitrary or invented. When the HOA did send out a notice that winter, it was to remind residents that the community snowplow contract required that cars be moved off the street before 6 a.m. on designated clearing days, which was a completely reasonable and legitimate reminder that nobody disputed. That's what an HOA is supposed to do. Coordinate reasonable things. Keep the shared spaces functional. Stay out of people's way about the rest. Bob Hensley moved out of Maplewood Ridge about 8 months after he resigned from the board. I don't know where he went. I don't hold a strong opinion about him either way. He'd been weak more than malicious, which is its own category of problem but not the same as what Vicki had done. He had signed things he should have scrutinized. He had nodded when he should have questioned. He had let someone fill the space he was supposed to occupy with something corrupt. That's a failure, but it's a different kind of failure. The house that had been Vicki's sat on the market for a few months before selling to a young couple who had no idea about any of the history. I saw them moving in on a cold February morning, carrying boxes through the snow, looking cheerful. I went over and introduced myself, helped them carry a few things in, told them the neighborhood was a good one. I meant it. They asked if there was anything they should know about the HOA. I thought about it for a second. I told them the new board was solid, the CC and RS were pretty reasonable, and if they ever got a notice that didn't make sense to just read the actual cited provision carefully before doing anything else. They said that seemed like good advice. It is. It really is. The frozen hose bib that started the whole thing thawed out perfectly in spring, just like it always did, and if you looked at it on a warm day, it was completely unremarkable. An ordinary outdoor faucet. 2 inches of pipe and a handle, doing its job, asking nothing in return, causing absolutely no harm to anyone or anything. Vicki Ledbetter had looked at it on a cold morning and seen a weapon she could use. What she hadn't accounted for was that a frozen hose bib, in the right circumstances, could be a weapon aimed both ways. I turned it on for the first time that second spring, felt the water run cold and then clear through the hose, and thought that there was something satisfying about that. About a thing just working the way it was supposed to. About a neighborhood doing the same. The ice had thawed. The ground was coming back to life, and Maplewood Ridge, with its imperfect, ordinary, stubborn collection of homeowners, was doing just fine.